Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Meet USA Study, your one-stop platform for guiding students through their college application journey. Access up-to-date resources on universities, programs, scholarships, and application requirements, all in one place. Get easy-to-access tools, personalised timelines, expert tips, application templates, and exclusive webinars with admissions officers to help your student stand out. Visit usastudy.co.uk or call Phil at 0800 612 8271 because every student deserves the opportunity to shine with USA Study.
Hey education changemakers, ready for something special? It's Bet Show's 40th anniversary and we're throwing a free celebration just for you. Join us at London Excel from January 22nd to 24th to connect, learn and be inspired. Picture this, 300 plus speakers who truly get it, 600 cutting-edge edtech companies, and all the fresh ideas you need to make 2025 your best year yet. So why wait? Head to uk.betshow.com, grab your free ticket and come celebrate with your peers. Because this is for you. See you at Bet.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I am Danny Wally, and you are listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Thank you so much for those of you who are joining us live. Please make sure that you engage in the chat and ask your questions and engage with the show. I am absolutely delighted tonight to welcome our two guests. I feel so honoured to be involved in this show. So just to introduce them, we have got Mark Ruslin here, who is the National Director of Learning at the National Holocaust Museum. Hi, Mark.
Good evening.
And you are joined as well by Pete Whitehead, who is working on the Commission into Countering Online Conspiracy Theories in Schools. So thank you so much for joining us, Pete.
Love to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's go straight into this, if this is okay, because I am sure that we are going to have too much to talk about and probably run out of time. So let's not waste a minute. So we are here tonight to talk about addressing the Holocaust through teaching in schools and actually directly addressing the conspiracy theories, which do seem to be getting a bit of traction in schools, and how is best to do those and approach those. So just to start, obviously, it is January, which is always Holocaust Memorial. So why should schools commemorate the Holocaust each year?
So I think there are many reasons. So I'm going to give two reasons and a kind of a warning. And the first reason is the what of the Holocaust. So it's a continent-wide genocide that happened across 22 countries of Europe, including the UK. So we're now uncovering lots of research that suggests that there was an element of the Holocaust that happened on the Channel Islands. So anything that large, that was an attempt to wipe out every single Jewish man, woman and child on the whole of the continent, along with the Roma and Sinti populations, it would be remiss of any educational system to not teach something of that magnitude that happened just within living memory. And so the what of the Holocaust, I think, requires us to study it alongside other things like the slave trade and other things. But it fits within that basket of European history. But really, to link it into what we're talking about tonight is the why. And the why is what we really lead on. So the why isn't just, Danny, I think you're a history teacher, aren't you? So you'll be well aware of students coming in year 8 or year 9 and thinking, well, Hitler woke up one morning, decided he didn't like the Jews and decided to kill them. And that's basically their understanding of the why of the Holocaust. And we obviously know that that isn't true, and that the Holocaust was almost the culmination of 2,500 years of anti-Jewish prejudice and hate. And those conspiracy theories and tropes about Jews really start with the very early days, the birth of Christianity. We see them come through places in England like Lincoln and Norwich and York and London, places where Jews congregated in the medieval period, where people started to say that the Jews had an unnatural evil power and predilection to money. And those ideas have just snowballed and snowballed. So when we see the Nazis in the Nazi period in the 1920s, 30s and 40s, the Nazis are broadly saying similar things. They're punching down at the Jews. They're saying that the Jews are inferior and dirty. And then they're punching up and saying, well, they're inferior, dirty, but they also control the world. They're also behind capitalist America and communist Soviet Union. And those ideas we still see today. So really the why is so important because, as you say, we're in an age of conspiracy theories, and I suppose we'll get on to why that might be the case. But conspiracy theories aren't a new thing. And the Holocaust really was a kind of the best example of what happens when you let conspiracy theories run amok. So that's my my two positive reasons why we should do it. The negative reason is just a warning, really, that if what we're doing is just memorializing something, but we're not thinking about the what and the why, then it's definitely at best neutral, and it might be at worst acutely negative, because what we end up doing is thinking about a group of people purely as victims, rather than a group of people with a living, breathing history of 4,500 years that thankfully carries on today.
Totally. And I wasn't sure whether to disclose that I'm a history teacher, but yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think just to pick up on two of the things that you said, to me, it's a moral imperative. And like you say, as a history teacher, we spend quite a lot of time, particularly at Key Stage 3, crafting our curriculum and making decisions really about what we want our students to learn. And for me, World War II and the Holocaust, as you say, in terms of why it happened, not just what happened, and actually the aftermath as well, is so important, because the idea for me that you could go all the way through high school, choose not to study history as an option, you might choose geography, and then you've gone through 5 years of secondary school education and not been exposed to these really key ideas, to me is just wrong. So I totally agree with you that it's imperative to me that it's included in every single curriculum. At my school in particular, we do a week for every Holocaust, 27th of January, isn't it? And we go off timetable for a week that week with history, and all of our history lessons are focused on the Holocaust. And like you say, the themes really of why it happened, because I think once you understand the why, that's where you almost become powerful to prevent it happening again. And I'm really glad, that you just touched on the idea of the UK, because one of the things that I find almost every year when we're talking to students about this is they just don't think it affected us. They just don't think this is a UK thing. They think this is a Germany thing. And it's actually tearing down those barriers and really making the students understand that this is our history as well. And like you say, actually that anti-Semitism came through our history thousands of years ago and was really rooted in our medieval history, the reigns of Edward I and Edward II. And we've really taken big strides in our curriculum to really expose that to the children so that they can see that this isn't just an isolated event. So yeah,
and not just that, to kind of bring that slightly more to the modern era. Yeah, there are medieval and pre-medieval antecedents in England, and a lot of what ended up as, we might say, stereotypical German thought of the early 20th century started 400 or 500 years before in England. But one of the things we teach at the museum to secondary school students, so students can come from year 5 upwards to the museum, and we can come to schools and we can do online lessons. But one of the things we do to the secondary students is we talk about the Bethnal Green tube disaster in 1943, where there was a tube crush, and just over 100 people were crushed to death. They rushed the tube station because the guns went off in a nearby park, and it was a practice, but they weren't told it was a practice. And the local council the next day blamed the crush on the excitable Jews who lived in the East End of London. Well, we say, how does that make you feel when you know that at the same time hundreds of thousands of Jews each month were being gassed and shot to death? And obviously there's a moral answer, but they say, well, nobody would have known in Britain. And then we say, well, actually, people did know in Britain. Churchill knew. It was in the papers. It was in Parliament. And then that gets us into a conversation of, well, actually, do you think we could have done anything about it? And that's a much richer conversation than just Britain was good, Germany was bad, it was sad, let's move on.
Yeah, definitely. And again, just to put my other cards on the table, my second subject is psychology. And I teach both GCSE and A-level psychology. And again, every single time, even though it's not in the exact same context, but we start talking about theories of obedience and conformity. And it goes back to that idea of studies kind of originating from the Holocaust into this idea that there was something to do with German people being different and being able to commit these crimes and do these things. And almost there's a safety in that, isn't there? In that belief that, oh, we just wouldn't do that. And it's quite interesting for me as a psychology teacher to really show the students the evidence that actually this is not a German thing. You know, this is a worldwide thing. And actually it's an event that was so, you know, it was so constructed, wasn't it? And it was so built from all angles. And as you've mentioned, from thousands of years worth of history, that it isn't something really that individuals necessarily could have changed because it became a movement. But we still have to take responsibility for that behavior. And we have to learn from that behavior to make sure it never happens again.
It did become a movement, but another one of the things that we teach, and we take this, we haven't made this up, we take it from history teachers might know the book Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning. Which was a group of quite often socialist and social democrat people from Hamburg who were forced to become members or chose to become members of a police unit that was part of the Einsatzgruppen in the Baltics during the first phase of the Holocaust. And what Browning found was that actually the person who ran that unit gave the unit the chance to opt out. And this wasn't a unique thing. And so the person, he actually ended up being executed after the war. But he gave the men, about 150 men, gave them the opportunity to opt out. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's something along the lines of 3 or 4 men chose to opt out.
Wow.
So actually what we're seeing there is, and the psychology of it isn't something that's rooted in the 40s. It's rooted in human psychology that's as true then as it is today. But actually what was going on there? Well, partly it's simple things like they were drunk. They were made to drink beforehand. They were all men. And the psychology of groups of men, I think, is interesting. The psychology of obedience is interesting. There might have been elements of pre-existing anti-Jewish racism and anti-Semitism there, but actually most students, maybe many teachers, would think that the price for failing to obey an order to shoot would be that you were shot. Well, actually, Ordinary Men suggests that wasn't the case, or it certainly wasn't the case in every case, and that people were obeying for maybe more human reasons than Holocaust-based reasons, if you put it that way. Pete, is there anything kind of bringing in the conspiracy theory angle to it? Because that might be part of it as well. That Ordinary Men doesn't really touch on it, but I suspect it's in the background.
Yeah, I think quite possibly. I mean, I will confess on this section that I am not a historian, although my background is in medieval literature, so I always get it's quite nice to have some reference points. But I think one of the things that comes out in the research, and I'm sure we'll sort of get onto that slightly later on. But I think this sort of sense of being swept up in belief, is something we observed sort of across our research.
Yeah, definitely. And do you know what? I'm going to get so lost in this conversation, I can tell already, because not only do I think it's such an important thing to discuss, I just think it's so fascinating. It's that idea of what happened, but why did it happen? And you've mentioned a few times, but that idea for me of, could the Holocaust happen again?
Well, my answer will be a very clear yes. Whether it will be the same group of people, who knows? But this idea that the Holocaust was basically an example of a powerful group picking on a less powerful group, I don't think bears scrutiny, actually, and bears up to the historical record. Because if we see the Nazis' anti-Jewish racism as being an element of punching down and punching up, the punching down, they thought that Jews, they typically, if you look at all the propaganda, Jews are portrayed as rats quite often, aren't they? And they're dirty, they're subhuman. A lot of the videos taken in the ghettos were taken for that purpose, to show them as subhuman. but that doesn't really explain the Holocaust, because the Nazis believed that plenty of groups were subhuman. The Slavs were subhuman, homosexuals are subhuman. It's the punching up which suggests why they chose this particular group alongside Roma and Sinti for complete annihilation. It's the punching up element of them believing that Jews were racially predisposed to power. And so they were dirty, they were rats, but they were also octopuses with their tentacles all around the earth. They controlled the major powers. There's that very famous propaganda poster just after the Soviet Union came into the war on the Allies' side of the Soviet flag, the American flag, and the British flag. And in front of them is the Jew. And it's the Jew. It's an imagined Jew. It's not Jews. It's not a specific Jewish person. So this idea that the Nazis picked on a small group of people, 0.7% of the population, they didn't. They were tapping into 2,000 years of history, of European history. A lot of it started in this country. And really the punching up element explains it more than the punching down. It was less that they despised the Jews, and it was more that they feared them. Hitler particularly felt that he was in a cosmic fight to the death and the Jews might win.
Yeah, because my students, whenever we talk about this, are always really astounded to realise how small the proportion of Jewish population within Germany was at the time. And actually, I totally am fascinated by what you're saying, this idea of punching up and almost the Nazis being intimidated by the power of the Jewish people, both historically almost as a legacy, but also the concern that they caused the Nazi Party at the time. But when you look at it, it was such a small percentage of Germany when Hitler particularly was gaining power. And he wasn't open, was he, about what he was doing necessarily? I know it was in Mein Kampf, but it was something almost that he held back, didn't he, until he got more power, and then really kind of opened the floodgates as he went into World War II in terms of the persecution. And is there a reason that you think he chose to do it that way? And I'm going back to this idea of what you're saying about punching up, and this idea that, once he conquered Poland and there were more Jews there, is it that the challenge to him almost increased that much that he then felt like he had to, increase his persecution of the Jews?
Well, I think we're getting into the functionalism, the intentionalism debates, aren't we? That have slightly moved on, I think, in the last few years. There's definitely an element where the war allowed things to happen that wouldn't have happened in a peacetime. I think there's also the Nazi racial view of the world, the Weltanschauung, suggested that you could behave in a way in the east of Europe, which was a way that they didn't behave in the west of Europe, albeit 90% of Dutch Jews died in the Holocaust. So actually the way that they behaved to Jews in the West compared to the East was sometimes quite similar. They just went about it in different ways. The interesting and appalling thing for me is some of the micro histories, particularly of the early months of the war, suggest that in some ways, in the East and the West, but particularly the East, where the Einsatzgruppen operated, the Nazis were pushing at an open door. So the area between East Prussia and Lithuania, the Soviets moved out, and there was a week or so before the Nazis moved in. And there are towns in the western part of Lithuania where the Nazis moved in with orders that they were to shoot any saboteurs and all Jews were saboteurs. But they couldn't find any Jews because the local Lithuanian population had already done the job and had killed every Jew in a town. And pretty much every town in that part of Lithuania is pretty heavily wooded, or was. There'll be a wood outside the town, and that is where the mass grave is. And quite often the mass grave wasn't an SS mass grave or a Nazi mass grave. It was done by the local population. So those pre-existing ideas, that pre-existing either loathing or fear of the Jewish population, sometimes the Nazis didn't even have to be there to make it happen. So the element of war allowed groups to do things that in peacetime they couldn't. But the pre-existing anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish racism, gave a legitimacy to that violence that was almost just waiting to happen.
It's so fascinating, Mark. Honestly, I feel like I could talk to you about this forever. I definitely need to get you engaged with my pupils. I know you've mentioned before that you do online lessons, because it is like you just said, isn't it? It's just layer upon layer upon layer. And this idea that, it's happening everywhere and there's always going to be untold stories. And I just feel like we've got such a responsibility, I think, to tell the stories. But trying to get myself back on topic a little bit. And Pete, just to bring you into the conversation a bit more. So how has this history, how has it now become almost like a feeder to so many conspiracy theories? What is a conspiracy theory, and how has this history almost become that?
So, in terms of what is a conspiracy theory, when the commission sort of began our research, one of the things that we sort of had to deal with was the fact that there are, sort of ongoing academic debates about how to define it. We sort of came to a conclusion that a conspiracy theory is. This one is, what we've sort of written down as a definition within the report. A proposed explanation of some event or events in terms of the significant causal agency of a relatively small group of persons acting in secret. Now, that doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. That is not a sort of snappy definition of it. I'd love to give one. But fundamentally, we did want to engage with the existing academic literature on that topic. And it is, that sort of... the small group can be a little bit sort of fuzzy. Like it can be a small group, it can be a slightly larger group, but but the sort of real trend you see is this sort of idea of a group acting in secret to some malign sort of intention behind it. So that's how we've defined a conspiracy theory. And so, as Mark's pointed out, right, like it's funny because one of the things, and again, I'm sure we'll probably dig into the sort of modern stuff and some of the work of the commission. But one of the things that really jumps out at me is that one of the things we wanted to say when we were doing the research is that I think a lot of this stuff comes out of a wider societal debate around young people and their relationship to the internet and content they see online. And I get that. That's a really important debate. But we didn't want it to be a quote unquote young person's issue. And I can talk sort of slightly later on, no doubt, about how this isn't just a young person's issue. And I also think that equally, I think very often we don't kind of draw on these historical threads. We tend to go, conspiracy theories. Well, they came along when we invented the internet. And you can go back, you can go back all the way to sort of medieval England. You can go back to the 60s and you've got people like listening to Beatles records backwards and going like, because I'm doing this because, Paul McCartney's secretly dead. Like this is a thing that pops up in different guises and in different ways, kind of throughout any iteration of society that you sort of choose to point at. So I think as much as it's not a young person issue, it also definitely is not just a contemporary issue either.
And Pete, just to kind of dive in on the top of that, to link it into the history of the 30s and 40s, the other two things that some of the academic literature says about conspiracy theories is that they always, the more they seek to explain everything, the more they're a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And the more that they are totally impervious to being disproved in a scientific way, the more they're a conspiracy theory. So on the first one, to give an example, I mean, technically, a lot of people would say the belief in the Loch Ness Monster is a conspiracy theory, which it isn't really. It's an erroneous belief. But quite often, people who believe that Nessie exists, first, don't we all want to believe that Nessie exists? I mean, it would be great if Nessie exists. So a lot of conspiracy theories are fun. They're more fun than the reality. But quite often what that is actually saying is the person saying is, I don't believe in the accepted roots of science and roots of authority. So actually, yeah, you would tell me that Nessie exists, but what I'm really saying is I'm one of this group of people who don't believe Nessie exists, and I'm not one of your group of people who believes in these crazy things like science and the historical record. And then anything that seeks to disprove that is evidence of the conspiracy itself. So if you're someone who believes that, and then someone comes along and does an echo sound, I'm way beyond my knowledge of science here, but does a sonar sound of Loch Ness and proves that Nessie isn't there, well, that's what you would say, isn't it? That's what a scientist would say. So actually, the evidence that Nessie doesn't exist is evidence that the conspiracy is true and that everybody's lying to you. And
Yeah,
so
of
actually
course.
it makes it, and maybe we're going to see a little bit more of this after what happened, 3 hours ago, and the people that are coming into power in the States. But a lot of these people, particularly RFK, he is a prime conspiracy theorist because he is completely impervious to doing the scientific method of looking for alternative facts and changing your view if the facts suggest that your view needs to change.
Yeah, and we're going a kind of a full way round now, because for me that's where the responsibility of schools come in, doesn't it? It's not, and you said this earlier, Mark, it's not just teaching the facts, it's teaching the skill, isn't it? The ability to ask questions and to query information that you've been given, but also to have that skill to access scientific information and to explore things in a really academic and sensible way. And I think when we're talking about the Holocaust, it's even more important, in my opinion, to have these open conversations about conspiracy theories, because they're so damaging and so dangerous. And I know your example was absolutely beautiful. I love the Loch Ness Monster example, and we've had a giggle and it was jovial, but it couldn't be further away from that example of conspiracy theories coming into the Holocaust. So I mean, I can only look at this from a teacher, but I know from conversations in my classroom that one of the most current conspiracy theories is the idea that Hitler never died. And I will try and explore that and break that down in the classroom with my children. And you realize quite quickly that their source from that comes from Nazi hunters. They will have watched a little clip from a television series which was purely created for drama, and they're going, no, miss, no, this is right. This is a fueled program where they're looking for Hitler, and did you know this? And they'll quote things to me from the show as if they're academic facts. And it happens every year. And I know this is why it's so important that we talk about it. So back to your point, Pete, because that's just an example. I know you said it isn't just young people, and I totally agree. And I do think there's a generational difference in how the conspiracy theories are passing down. But why do you think then these conspiracy theories are seen in UK schools today?
That's really interesting. So we don't, one of the things the Commission sort of doesn't do is sort of try and make a diagnosis around why, because we think it's an enormously complicated thing. I think there are sort of trends you can point to. There are sort of economic headwinds. There are various things that you can point to, but we don't try and make a prescription or a sort of diagnosis as to sort of why this is happening. What we wanted to do was look at what is going on in UK classrooms, what are the views of young people, of teachers, and of parents, which I've envisioned as the three sort of groups that would be impacted by this. So I can't really say as to why, but what I can say, just sort of going back to sort of your point previously about sort of schools being a place where this sort of discourse can happen, is one of the things that I found hugely interesting about this piece of research, which is, so at Public Affairs, which is the company I work for, we very often do opinion research with teachers, and we try and make sure that when we do research into education, that what we do is grounded in the lives of ordinary teachers around the country. So we do an awful lot of opinion research, and I will hold my hands up and say, mea culpa, I've never been a teacher. And I know that I'm speaking to two educators.
That's why you look so young, Pete.
If I turn a little bit more, the greys really will start coming out. Time comes for us all. But one of the things that I found really interesting is that very often when we speak to teachers, one of the things we hear about quite a lot is, well, for too long there is a social problem, and what is the solution? Stick that on the curriculum. And teachers talk about like the workload, the fact that schools are sort of this catch-all place where everything can be solved. And this comes up when we talk about other stuff. But when we spoke about conspiracy theories and misinformation and disinformation, one of the things I found really interesting was that teachers were quite keen to address it in a way that in a way that some topics that we do research on, there's a sense of like, well, maybe schools could do this, but of course. But for this topic, there was a very real sense that no, something has to be done. So I can't say I can't say what the reasons are, which is like roundabout answer. I can't say what the reasons are, but what I can say is there is an appetite for addressing it, which I think is a really interesting thing in of itself.
Just to come in on that, I mean, research we've done, and I know I can't remember the exact numbers, Pete, but it's echoed in the reports, found that about 50% of the British adult public believe in conspiracy theories. They believe in at least one.
Wow.
So the idea that this is a group of, a very small group of people in their parents' garages, scrolling the internet. No, it's about 50%, and that holds true across most Western democracies. It's about 50%. And the best way of predicting whether you believe in a conspiracy theory is, did you already believe in one? So broadly, there's 50% of the population that are pretty fairly disposed to believe in conspiracy theories, and there's about 50% that are not, broadly. Now, within that 50%, there's about 20% who believe in some version of overt anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. So Jews control the world, Jews control the media, Jews can shapeshift, Jews are always more loyal to something else, sometimes Israel, than they are to their own country. And these are ideas that have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. So about 1 in 5 people believe in something pretty anti-Semitic. About 1 in 2 believe in something conspiratorial, broadly. So why wouldn't schools be part of this? Because they represent society. And what's interesting is, and it's borne out in the research, is a lot of what we're assuming is that you'd have children who might believe in conspiracy theories, you'd have parents that maybe believe in conspiracy theories, but the assumption being that schools will be conspiracy theory free zones. But of course, teachers are part of the population as well. So it might not be 50-50, but it's significant numbers of teachers who do believe in conspiracies. I used to be, I was a head of English and assistant head before I joined the museum. And I remember a teacher I worked with who swore blind that governments around the world had made up dinosaurs. Absolutely swore blind that dinosaurs clearly couldn't have existed.
Well, that's not going to do well for the trust we're trying to get parents to have in the education system.
There we go. Now, she wasn't a science teacher, thankfully, but
that's a start.
So I think there are many reasons, but I would suggest that one of them is it would be fairly odd if schools didn't have an issue with conspiracy theories, given that the whole of society broadly has. One other little interesting bit is we always assume that conspiracy theories are things that are right at the top of people's minds. And the evidence doesn't suggest that at all. So my favourite it's an academic peer-reviewed paper, but it interviewed Greek football fans in the last decade, and it interviewed the away and the home fans as they went into the stadium. And it's a game in the Greek Premier League, no Israeli players, no Jewish players on either team. And as people went in, they found minimal levels of anti-Semitism when people went in. One of the team wins. They interview both sets of fans on the way out. The winning team, nothing's changed. The losing team, anti-Semitism has gone through the roof. And there's no Jewish players, no Israeli players. There's no way that you can legitimately blame your team's loss on a Jewish world conspiracy. But people are, the moment they're coming out. So this basket of ideas, this conspiratorial basket of ideas of kind of a nefarious evil power that connects itself to Jews and Judaism, A, it's hundreds of years old, and B, it just sits under the surface, just waiting to come out in times of stress, personal, societal. And you see it in the letters home from the front of German soldiers in the First World War and the Second World War. You would expect the anti-Semitism in the Second World War, given that it's a Nazi-inspired genocidal war, you would expect much more reference to Jews in those letters than in the First World War. Not the case. It's fairly similar amounts. What you do see in both eras is whenever a soldier loses a battle, or whenever they have a personal heartache on the front, so they lose a friend, or letters from home bring them some bad news, your wife has left you, something like that, anti-Semitism goes through the roof in the next letter. So it's a grab bag of things. It's a group of people who are easy to blame for things which clearly are completely unconnected to them.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Meet USA Study, your one-stop platform for guiding students through their college application journey. Access up-to-date resources on universities, programs, scholarships, and application requirements, all in one place. Get easy-to-access tools, personalised timelines, expert tips, application templates, and exclusive webinars with admissions officers to help your student stand out. Visit usastudy.co.uk or call Phil at 0800 612 8271 because every student deserves the opportunity to shine with USA Study.
Hey education changemakers, ready for something special? It's Bet Show's 40th anniversary and we're throwing a free celebration just for you. Join us at London Excel from January 22nd to 24th to connect, learn and be inspired. Picture this, 300 plus speakers who truly get it, 600 cutting-edge edtech companies and all the fresh ideas you need to make 2025 your best year yet. So why wait? Head to uk.betshow.com, grab your free ticket and come celebrate with your peers. Because this is for you. See you at Bet.
And how do you think that and this is a genuine question because I'm absolutely loving speaking to you both about this, and it's really got me thinking so much, like I say, with kind of my psychology head, but also my history teacher head. And I've obviously only got my experiences within a classroom. But when we're thinking about these conspiracy theories that are really growing traction, say with our young people, and I know, Pete, you said it's not just young people, but in a school setting, I think my question to both of you as absolute experts on this is, what would you say are the most prominent conspiracy theories within the young people of today? And almost why do you think that they're growing within young people? And I know, Mark, you've talked a lot about the growth of anti-Semitism and the idea of a scapegoat, and actually almost a scapegoat providing safety to people, that idea that they've got somebody to blame. But I would say, from my personal experience, I think conspiracy theories are much more prominent in young people now than I think they were, say, 2 decades ago. So I suppose my very bland question to you is, what do you think are the biggest conspiracy theories that our children are almost being exposed to? And why do you think they're almost like accepting them more now than maybe they did before in the past?
Do you want to Mark, or shall I?
Yeah. Do you want to kick off, Pete, from the research?
So again, I think there'll be a couple of times I have to do this and sort of be a bit of a spoil sport. Another thing we didn't test, and I will explain why, but we did not test this. We had a massive discussion in the research team about should we look at what's really prevalent, but we decided no. And the reason for that was that there are some conspiracy theories and there are modes of conspiratorial thinking, as we have discussed, that reverberate throughout history. But very often, particularly online, this takes the form of very sort of cyclical cycles in, cycles out stuff. So a really good example of this, now, whether it's a conspiracy theory or not is debatable. We put it under misinformation. But Andrew Tate came up a lot in the research we did. But at the same time, by towards the back end of the research cycle, I was doing focus groups with young people, and they'd say to me, "Oh, Andrew Tate, that was last year's stuff. That we've all moved on." Now, the question: have they moved on in terms of the fact they spent a year imbibing misogynist content? Have they moved on in terms of their attitudes and beliefs, or have they just found a new figure who's saying very similar stuff, just in a different package and a different coloured Bugatti that he takes his videos in front of, right? So, we didn't want to look at the individual conspiracies themselves. What we wanted to look at was how conspiracies as thoughts and misinformation and disinformation were manifesting within schools. We did a little bit of attitudinal research about sort of what could make for greater susceptibility to conspiracy theories. So we do have some of this. But what I will say, just aside from that, is that we, at the start of the report, we do have a sort of brief list of conspiracy theories that we were sort of aware of going into it. So that included COVID-19. vaccine mis and disinformation. That came up in focus groups. We had 1 or 2 instances, particularly with adults, of 9/11 conspiracy theories. Now, this is mostly instances within sort of qualitative research. So we can't sort of make massive generalizations from that, because you'd really want a sort of bigger sample. You'd want to do a poll, which we did do for separate issues. But I would say, I'd say that that's the reason we didn't. I can't give a sort of very clear answer on this. It's because we didn't look at it, but for those reasons. But Mark might have something else on this.
I think that's fascinating, Pete. Genuinely, thank you.
It's, I mean, definitely there's part of the element is social media, isn't it? It can't not be. And I suspect part of that is more children and adults are seeing the same content. So actually they're clustering around specific theories in a way that 25, 30 years ago maybe wouldn't have happened. I think as well that the action of the algorithm, actually what would be interesting is comparing not now versus 2000, but now versus 10 years ago. So kind of pre-algorithmic social media. Because the algorithm, it has to tend to extreme. So you start here and you move out to the extremes by the action of the algorithm, showing you more and more extreme content on the path that you're on. And I think that's got to be an element. And I know a lot of the academic research suggests that the nature of the conspiracy theory hasn't changed because of social media. My gut would tell me, just having been in the classroom and now having worked in this area, I'm not so sure that's true, because I think that the ease, the speed with which conspiracy theories can spread, well, Goebbels would have loved it. And the ease with which they can, over a tiny space of time, both accelerate in reach and accelerate in extremism, I think means that they can bandwagon, they can bring in a load of things that are both historical and new in ways that has never happened before. So I'm not so sure that we won't come back to this in the next 5-10 years and actually say, you know what, social media has fundamentally changed the nature of a conspiracy theory. But I want to come back to that 50% figure, because 50%, if half of people in pretty much every Western democracy are believing in conspiracy theories, that suggests it's not a glitch. It's part of the human design. So to take it to your psychology, now I am not a biologist. I'm not an evolutionary biologist. This tends to ring true, but I'm sure there'll be teachers on this session that will say that it doesn't. But there's an element of this that's true, that you're on the savannah tens of thousands of years ago, and you're with your pack of hunter-gatherers, and something rustles in the grass. Now you've got a choice. You could either say it's the wind, or it's an animal that's going to eat me. Now, if you say it's the wind and you're wrong and it's an animal, you're going to die. You get eaten. So your false negative is pretty dangerous. Now, your false positive, you assume it's a dangerous animal, you run away, and it wasn't a false animal. It wasn't a dangerous animal. It was the wind. Well, your false positive gets you nothing more than a ribbing from your fellow hunter-gatherers. But you don't die, so you still get to pass on your genes further down the line. Now, there's an element where the false positive actually describes in quite a few ways the mindset of the conspiracy theorists. Because what the conspiracy theorist does is joins the dots in a way which suggests causation among a bunch of facts, all of which may be facts, but for which there isn't causation. And actually that idea that psychologically we are predisposed to be conspiracy theorists, I think is borne out by a lot of the academic research and the kind of numerical research, which shows just how widespread these theories are. And so actually, psychologically, it's not a glitch.
I just think that's so fascinating. And actually, I love that analogy. And when you pair the two things, like almost like two golden threads that I would pull that you've both just said, is this idea of us needing to believe in a conspiracy theory, but also that idea of COVID. And I'd just like to pick up on that a little bit, Pete, because I think for me, particularly for our young people, that was a real opportunity where I think young people saw their parents and their role models really openly discussing conspiracy theories, and that idea of, have we made this up? Is the government correct? Is the government wrong? Has it made a mistake? And I think there was a bit of a broken trust there between our young people, and they openly started to question the information that they were being given from people in positions of trust. And to me, having kind of witnessed that as both a parent and as a teacher, I think that very much opened the floodgates into children kind of accepting conspiracy theories and really starting to think that there might be some traction there. So I found this conversation absolutely fascinating, but I really want to get to the nitty gritty. It's the teacher in me. I just want to know then, what can we do and what should we be doing to combat these conspiracy theories within our classroom?
Mark, do you want to take this or shall I go?
Well, I think I need to start naming you. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Why don't you start with the stuff that an overview of what the commission has recommended?
Yeah, so I can't. We haven't launched yet. So this one is not me saying we didn't do the research. It's saying that it comes out in February. Okay. So I would heartily recommend going to have a look at the commission report when it comes out. It will launch in February. I am very much looking forward to it. But what I will say, I think what I probably can say is in sort of quite broad brushstrokes. And one of the things that I think needs to happen, and I think that's an incredibly arrogant way of putting the commission's recommendations. It just happens.
At this moment, you are the commission, Pete. So
there are better people than me on it, I can assure you. But one of the things I think comes out really clearly is that schools and parents need to work together on this. I think that is something that we see as really clear. And I think that is two ways. The first is the really obvious one, right? It's the one that everyone jumps to, which is parents should sort of, help the school deal with this stuff. So it gets taught in school and parents reinforce their home. And that is, I think, most people's sort of mental model of how that relationship works. But I also think parents as a sort of byword for wider communities and, sort of people with a vested relationship with schools need to give schools and teachers in particular the space to deal with this stuff. Because I think a lot of teachers, for various reasons, feel that taking stuff on in the classroom, especially quite charged discussions, is just incredibly difficult. And I think that the atmosphere to do that has got more difficult. And I think that we need to sort of really consciously grasp that issue and make sure that, sort of from a structural perspective, that it is easier for teachers to deal with this. So that sort of thread is something, again, when the recommendations come out, when we launch, I think is quite visible. Because one of the things we sort of really want to do, having spoken to teachers via polling and focus groups, is make sure that it was rooted in their experience in the classroom. And I think that is one of the very clear threads that comes out of it, this sense that we need to empower teachers to deal with this stuff. And that is both giving them the knowledge they need so they can pass knowledge on, but it's also about giving them that protection and that space to do it.
Definitely. And Mark, I will come to you in a moment for your, input on this, as particularly from the point of view of the museum, because I'm sure this is something that you address on a daily basis. But just picking up on what you mentioned there, Pete, I totally agree with you that we have to almost craft that classroom where it's safe for children to express their true views, and almost, I think, for those to be explored with an expert and a professional that can kind of tease those out and tease those ideas out of the children. But also, we mentioned earlier about giving them the skills, almost the life skills that they need to challenge conspiracy theories throughout their life when they're later exposed to them again. And I suppose my question is, how can we facilitate a situation with teachers where they both feel protected, as you said, and also almost informed, and they've got the evidence to create that in a classroom? So is it that we provide the information and ask them to read it before they go in? Is it that we do it as larger groups? Do we do it where there's groups of professionals with bigger groups of children and addressing that? And I know, Mark, I'm sure you're going to say that this is something that the National Holocaust Museum can do, because I know you mentioned before about live lessons and online learning. But I think I'm just imagining my classroom and I'm thinking, I have been teaching a really long time. I would feel really, I'm too scared to say confident, but almost open to exploring some of these ideas with the children and having faith, I suppose, in my ability to pull them back if I think they're going a bit far. But I can think of colleagues that I've worked with that might not be as confident. So again, my very long-winded question, Pete, is there a way of doing this where practitioners support each other to create that environment?
I think there is. And I think one of the things that we do with the recommendations is we sort of split them into sections, because I think, again, one of the kind of overarching themes is that I don't think this has kind of one individual solution. And on a sort of micro level, I think a really good example of this is when you look at best practice to how to deal with this stuff in the classroom, because there is a decent body of sort of research into how, from a pedagogical perspective, how to deal with this stuff, which says sometimes you just have to shut it down. And a really good example of this, by the way, is that it's like we talk a lot about sort of knowledge when we talk about teaching for kind of obvious reasons, but if you take a sort of random NQT, right, who's like in the classroom, not been teaching very long, they're teaching, whatever lesson you want, and a child who has really deep-seated conspiratorial beliefs starts talking about them, chances are that child might actually know a bit more, or will certainly know specific facts compared to the teacher. So, they, like insert conspiracy theory here, like let's just take Nessie, because I think that's a sort of uncontroversial and nice one, right? Like this child may be able to say, well, I know what temperature Nessie can live at and you don't. And the teacher doesn't. And I know how deep Nessie likes to live and you don't. If you know so much, miss, why can't you tell me how deep Nessie can dive?
Yeah.
And what do you say to that? So I think part of it is sort of equipping them with knowledge. Part of it is providing professional development opportunities, making sure that is, a thing that teachers can access. Part of that is going to be structural when we think about how we deal with this at the individual school level, but also kind of trust and wider education system level. So there are a bunch of things that we have to do. And I don't think there is a sort of individual solution for any classroom, let alone any school or wider system. But what I think we need to do is to say, this is a problem. We socially have decided that we should be dealing with it. And therefore, we need to pull these levers to create an atmosphere where this can be addressed. It's not about individual reforms. It's about thinking about wider systems and how can you do a bunch of different things that allow teachers that space, that knowledge, that development, and so on. In other words, creating a sort of ecosystem around this stuff.
Yeah, I'm frantically nodding. I totally agree, Pete. Totally. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, definitely building on that is and not but. I think the big thing with this is to take each case on its own merits.
Yeah.
So some cases may, the example that P gives, it might be a safeguarding response actually that's needed. Which might be an individual safeguarding, or might be an evidence of something in the community that is more of a problem. So I think the one approach that is controversial is the behavioural punishment approach. But actually, even there, if you have a child that is shouting out conspiratorial beliefs purely to derail the lesson, well, actually, that's different to a child who is voicing deeply held but clearly wrong conspiratorial beliefs. So that's the first thing I would say. Second thing, take it back to the Holocaust, is I think what's really important, and I think there's a danger of us kind of saying, woe is us, everything was better back in our day, the music was better, all of this. Because I'm not sure that's true, albeit the social media angle makes it more complicated, is that we have to empower children and teachers to be much more discriminatory about where they get their information from and how they interrogate that information. So to take the example of the Holocaust, a child might legitimately question, I don't think it is possible in these small-ish gas chambers for 6 million people to be murdered. Yeah. And if the history teacher doesn't have the knowledge to say, you know what, you're right, because 6 million Jewish people weren't murdered in gas chambers.
Yeah.
They were killed in ghettos. They were killed in killing pits. So if they're not able to answer that with detailed historical knowledge, then that's a real problem, because that child might go away and think there's something there, even if they didn't really think there was something there in the first place.
Yeah.
I think the real danger with that is that the teacher goes for the punitive approach and actually shuts it down, when actually the child, that is a legitimate question to ask, albeit the teacher has to very, very legitimately deal with it and strongly deal with it, so that no one leaves that room thinking that that is correct. Flip it again, say the child says, well, actually, this group of people have been persecuted for 2,500 years. They have all the power in the world and they use it against the likes of you and me. And so Hitler was right. Well, that is something very, very different. And that is, well, for me, thinking back to my time in the classroom, there's definitely a prevent referral there. And there's definitely an extremism worry and a safeguarding concern, and might require you to say, actually, I'm going to isolate that possible child, but certainly that viewpoint, because that is not a legitimate thing to say when we're interrogating the causes and the consequences of the Holocaust. So I think it's sometimes termed media literacy, isn't it? But I don't think that really encompasses it. And I also don't think it's a purely child-based issue. And actually, I think a lot of the issues now are maybe parents and grandparents' age, where they grew up pre-social media. And so what they're doing is saying, there's the BBC, there's the Times, there's the blah, 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 and there's Facebook, and there's X, and they're not applying a rigorous fact-checking approach in their mind to what they're reading online. And then I think there's a danger with older generations where they're just not equipped to do it because they didn't do it when they were growing up. I think the biggest, but this is purely my personal view, biggest danger for young people is that they tend to a kind of overarching nihilism, where they think, oh, it's all too bloody difficult. There's all these sources of information being chucked at me. I don't know which one's true. Therefore, they're probably all false. And so what they actually come out thinking, there is no source of objective, accurate truth. And they're not able to do, say, in a history lesson, say, well, look, actually, some of the academic research that came out in the early 60s about the Holocaust, we now know not to be true. It's not that the historian was deliberately wrong. It's just that's the process of historical research. But what they're doing, because of the conspiratorial mindset, is they're almost opting out of that process of historical research. And the same in science. So they're not understanding that there is a big difference between active and deliberate misinformation and the basic process of research.
It's understanding history as a craft, isn't it? It's understanding history as an academic study, and how actually disproving previous things doesn't mean that it was a conspiracy. It doesn't mean you were given misinformation. It's a discipline that evolves over time, and our ability to investigate it develops. What I found really interesting, and from both of your answers really there, and just thinking at it from my point of view, is we're asking a lot, aren't we, of history teachers for all the right reasons. But I think one of the things that I was listening to is a mental model of how to address these things in the classroom is so complex, isn't it, for the teacher? Because it's that idea of recognizing, and the examples you gave, Mark, were amazing, but it's recognizing, isn't it? Is that child genuinely misinformed, confused, and not really sure? Is that child harboring quite dangerous beliefs that we need to shut down? Is that something that needs to be explored, like you say, with historical expertise to kind of address that? And I think it goes back to what you said, really, to me, Pete, about that idea of supporting teachers and training teachers and providing materials for teachers to work collaboratively with their colleagues, to almost kind of walk through these different scenarios and say, right, what would you do here? What would you do here? And almost, it sounds, I think I probably am saying, almost rehearse them, to have that strength and that, explore these in a safe environment with your colleagues, so that you're armored and you're ready to address them in the correct manner within the classroom, particularly for some of our less experienced teachers. Oh, I just think this is fascinating. So Mark, how can the work of the National Holocaust Museum, how can that contribute here? How can this benefit schools?
So our museum is in North Nottinghamshire. So if your school is near North Nottinghamshire, we'd love to see you there. So we're one of only 3 museums in the world that are equipped to teach primary age children. So we take year 5 upwards. In year 5, 6, and 7, they enter into the room of a German Jewish family in the late 1930s, and they go through their family house. They go into a fully equipped 1930s classroom where all the desks were desks in the mid-30s in German schools. And you have the race signs posters on the wall that were in German schools and the picture of Hitler that was in a German school. They go down a street in the middle of Kristallnacht, and then they see the family's home after Kristallnacht when it's been destroyed. And the elder son, but not the younger daughter, gets out on the Kindertransport. So we use that to show the rising tide of prejudice and also to teach some complicated things. So there's a character that appears who is kind of a local busybody who chides the German Jewish child when he plays with a German non-Jewish child, and chides the non-Jewish child. And we use that character to say, well, why do you think this lady's behaving like this? And the children normally say something like, well, she's heard Hitler's propaganda. She's been brainwashed. And actually we use that to say, well, if you just hear someone on the radio, or you just hear your teacher or your parents, and you just listen, does that make you brainwashed? And they'll say, no. We say, well, pretty unlikely then, isn't it? So maybe there was some element here where people believe this stuff about Jews, and maybe you might believe stuff about different groups that we want to interrogate in some way. So that's for the younger groups. With the older groups, we take them on a kind of 3-stage process where we use our main exhibition, and we use it to teach them about a little bit of the pre-existing anti-Jewish racism, and then teach them what happened in the Holocaust. And then we do a series of sessions to look at why it happened. So some of those are, we take a couple of examples. We look at 2 ladies who are both Austrian, and one of them was a librarian in the late 30s, and she refused to serve Jewish customers. And she remembers this. I mean, she's crying when she says it. We've got the video testimony of her. So she was clearly a low-level perpetrator, but she was a perpetrator. We've got another lady who did nothing, but she did cycle to Berchtesgaden to see Hitler. And when she was filmed about 10 years ago, was an unrepentant Nazi. She thought Hitler was right. Nothing that the Third Reich did was wrong. But she didn't do anything. And so we use this to tease out these quite difficult concepts of complicity and perpetration and bystanders. And actually, who's the bystander here? The bystander is the person you hate the most. And actually, maybe these categories aren't particularly useful. And then we look at a series of people and we try to assess. We use what we've learned about the why and the 2,000 years of anti-Jewish racism and anti-Semitism. And we say, right, we're going to start with Hitler. Scale of 0 to 100. How much is Hitler to blame? Children don't always say 100. And we say, okay, mostly they're towards the end of 100. But Hitler didn't kill anyone personally. So can he be to blame? And he wasn't at the Wannsee conference that planned this. So can he be to blame? And so we're always knocking them off balance. And then we move on to Himmler and the SS. And then we move on to the populations of the occupied countries. And then we finish with Churchill. And we say, well, was Churchill to blame? And most English children will say no. And we say, well, Churchill knew this. And this is when he knew it. And he knew it over 2 years before Auschwitz was liberated. So how about now? And they start to change their view and say, well, but could he have done anything? Could he have bombed the train tracks? And there are different views there. So all the time, what we're trying to do is get away from this black and white view of goodies and baddies and actually say it's much more nuanced. So we do the what, we do the why, and then we take them through to the final bit, which we call so what, which is you've learned about these tropes and conspiracy theories. You've learned about why it happened. Now let's apply it to real life. And the real life are always school-based scenarios. So one of them has a group of people discussing the Holocaust, and they end up discussing Jews. And one person says, well, you say what you want about Jews because they're all rich and powerful and they're really good at business. And we tease out, is that okay? Because some people say, well, that's a nice thing. but then we link it back to what we've learned about punching up and punching down, and the fact that the conspiracy theory that Hitler was really concerned with was about Jewish power and Jewish money. And we interrogate the thing that the student has said and say, well, actually, sounds depressingly familiar. Sounds very familiar to what the Nazis were saying. So we're trying to, in 4 hours of being at the museum, it's all educator-led. All of our educators are ex-teachers. We think that's important because it's an important subject. And too much museum education, I think, is left to people who are very talented amateurs. So we really want the children not to be experts in 2,500 years of anti-Semitism or the Holocaust even, but to understand a bit about the history, a bit about the why, and a bit about why it matters. And then we look at Holocaust denial, distortion, and glorification. So we do that program on site, but obviously for many schools it's difficult to get to us. So we do it online. And we do it in person, so we can send educators out into schools. If your school has 30% or more pupil premium, that's probably free because we have funders who fund that for us. And then we do other projects. So a bit of a kind of advertisement for us here, but we last year a film came out called The Commandant's Shadow, which was the film of the conversation between Dr. Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, who was the cellist in the SS Camp Guards Orchestra at Auschwitz. And she survived because she was a cellist before the war, and she was chosen for that role. And she's 99 now and lives in London. And 2 years ago, she agreed to meet with the son of Rudolf Höss. The commandant of Auschwitz, he was executed after the war, and his son, who grew up in the villa on the outskirts of Auschwitz, so one of the walls of his family garden was the wall of Auschwitz, and he remembers it. He remembers sitting with his father. He remembers hearing the sounds in the camp. The cellist of Auschwitz agreed to meet the son of the commandant of Auschwitz, and this movie was made of it. And we were asked by HBO and Warner Brothers to produce 4 hours of lessons to go with the movie. And you're Danny being a teacher, and I remember it from my time in the classroom. So many lessons produced by organisations like ours. You get sent a big booklet, and it's great. You never open it, or you get sent a lovely PDF with 100 sheets in that I'm sure is great, but you never open it. And what we wanted to do was get away from that, and we can do that because we're all ex-teachers, remember what it's like. So we did them all in video format. So we've done 5 20-minute PSHE lessons, so you can run them across a form time. And I remember being a form tutor, and I would have bitten anyone's hand off for that. And then we did a music lesson, an English lesson, and a history lesson. And they're all based on the national curriculum. So the history lesson asks, did the Holocaust end in 1945? So we're looking at generational trauma.
Yeah.
Can Hans-Jürgen, the son of the commandant, be blamed for what Rudolf Höss did? In the English lesson, we take the speaking and listening curriculum and we pull apart the movie and we analyse how the son of the commandant and the cellist speak. She's much more forthright and he's much more, I suppose he reflects inherited guilt in many ways. We use the curriculum to pull that apart, tone, body language and all of that. And then music, we look at who owns music. So when Anita played the cello, did she own the music? Did the guards own the music? Did the victims of Auschwitz own the music? And then we bring it up to the modern day and say, well, should we still listen to this music that Anita played? And I think a lot of children would say no, but Anita says yes. And then we say, well, let's look at some other people. We know a lot about what Wagner thought about Jewish people. Should we listen to Wagner? And then we end it with Kanye West. And we say, well, we know what Kanye West thinks about Jewish people because he's tweeted about it. Deeply anti-Semitic tweets. He's been dropped by many of his sponsors for it. But loads of people like his music. Does your answer change?
Oh, Mark, I'm so sold, I'm not even joking. I'm literally writing down. I'm like, right, I'm going to go get this curriculum. I'm going to run this in the school. We're coming to the museum. I'm bringing
please do.
kids. I am,
Yeah, so
honestly.
the Commandant's Shadow lessons are at tcslessons.org.uk. And we've
TCS
emailed them
lessons.
to every secondary school in England.
100%. I honestly, I think I got a little bit lost listening to you then, like genuinely, and I'm not just saying this, like just picturing the idea of the students in the museum moving through those rooms, but also how you've explained that they really get the opportunity to explore those pieces of information in isolation, and then as they go through the rooms, they look at them collectively as they gain more information. And I think that's so reflective of some of the ideas that we've talked about today, where children get the opportunity to explore some of the thoughts and reactions and emotions that they feel, but as you've said, by educators who are qualified and ready to challenge those and deal with those in the right way. I promise I'm not just saying this, I am absolutely sold, and I've got your email address now, so I'm going to be hounding you. It's happening. We're coming. Make some space for me.
Yeah, and also, particularly we're linking it to conspiracy theories. Yes, the educators at the museum can deal with it, but I've no doubt that plenty of the children who come have got some pre-existing conspiratorial ideas about maybe Jews, but certainly about the Holocaust and certainly about that wider ecosystem. Well, you can ask one of our educators, or most of the schools that come still get to meet a survivor. Why do you ask them?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this while you were speaking. So during COVID, we did almost like online lessons with Holocaust survivors, and we had 2 that we were able to provide the opportunity for our students to talk to. And I nearly mentioned it earlier because I'll never forget the message that was given so strongly. And it's very similar to what you've just said with the Kanye West example. It's that idea of linking this to make it relevant for the students' lives. And I remember he said to the children, because one of them asked, one of them said, what do you want us to learn? What do you want us to take from everything that you've told us? And he said, when you see that child on the yard or the playground that is sat on their own and no one is speaking to them, go over and show that kindness. And it really resonated. My students still talk about it today because it can feel quite abstract exploring ideas like this. And actually what he did is pull that relevance into their lives. Very similar, like you say, to what you've just talked about with that music lesson, to, well, you've got an opinion on this now relate it to Kanye West, something that's very present in your lives. And I just think that's so important when we're addressing conspiracy theories, the Holocaust and history, to make it relevant to the students' lives.
And not to make it trite. So an example I give where we teach 9, 10, 11-year-olds. So they're sitting in literally the Nazi classroom. One of the desks has a swastika from the 30s scratched into it. And we say, look, Leo, who's the German Jewish child, Leo is made to sit at the back of the class, in the back row, from history lessons. And Fritz, his non-Jewish friend, laughs at this. He didn't before, but now he does. How do we feel? What should Fritz do? And plenty of teachers and children will say, he should stand up for Leo. And we used to teach that, but now we've kind of flipped it and said, well, okay, he should. That's a lovely idea, but who's telling him not to stand up? Everyone else in the class is saying, don't do it. His family are saying, don't do it. The teacher is saying, don't do it. The government are saying, don't do it. Are we really saying a 10-year-old's going to do it? I mean, amazing if he does, but what would that even do?
Yeah.
So I think there are ways that even with young children, 9, 10-year-olds, you can bring in this idea that there comes a point at which it's probably too late.
Yeah.
And actually,
oh my gosh.
if we've got to that point where everyone's ignored the kid in the corner of the playground and everyone's accepted a form of behavior and discussion and language about them rather than us, we might already be too far along the line.
Well, honestly, I'm sat in here thinking, if that's the point, then we have failed as educators, haven't we? Because it's actually it's what we should be doing, particularly as a history teacher. And I mentioned before this moral imperative. It's absolutely there. Do you know what, Mark, Pete? I honestly, I could talk to you for another 2 hours. Like, genuinely, I've still got questions that I've been writing down while you've been talking. But it's okay, Mark, because I'm going to come to the museum, so I can ask you then when I see you there.
Do it there.
Genuinely, though, both of you, I think we've talked about such an important topic tonight, and I think we've explored, as you said, Mark, you know, the what, the why, the where, the when, but also we've come up with some real pointers here, I think, for educators to explore in a little bit more detail. And to me, if they're having that conversation, then everything we've done tonight has had the right impact. You know, if they're talking with other educators about how to address this, and I know you've mentioned the report, Pete, that I really hope people engage with in February. I just think hopefully now we've started a discussion that should really be happening to make a change in our schools. So I just want to thank you both for your time. It's been a real honour for me, and I'm really not just saying this, Mark. I am 100% coming. And I'm reading the report, Pete. You've both inspired
Go
me.
visit Pete as well.
I will. You didn't tell it to me as well, Pete. No, I'm joking. I'll definitely read the report as well. But thank you both so much for your time. It's meant the world to me. And like I say, I really hope that we get the opportunity to speak again. So thank you.
Lovely.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.